All right, I'm Steve Wood, recovered alcoholic.
And my name is Howard Eber. I am a recovered alcoholic and addict also.
So we started Bill's story last week and we got through a whole 4 pages, which is not usually our MO in here.
Woo-hoo.
Um, Last week we started you know, really looking at Bill's decline, to where we used the term doom curve, which, doom is condemned to death or ruin, and curve means something that's bending in not a straight direction, usually maybe going downwards. So a doom curve is a dangerous change in direction, leading to a downward spiral, even death. And so far we only covered three of those. There's 30, so there's like ways to go on these doom curves. But the first one was my drinking assumed more strenuous portions containing all day and almost every night. And the second one was the reminiscences of my friends 10 in a row, and I became a lone wolf. And Doom Curve 3 was I began to be jittery in the morning. And we're on page 4. Anything you want to say about that, Howard, first before we start? Or
Rob, if you want, you can put up the Doom curve. We have a copy of it that we can put up, and then Rob can put up in the chat if you'd like a copy of that. Um, did Where are we starting today? Are we starting at
we're well, we're on page 4, and all this will lead them up to where we like last week we closed with the stock market crashing.
yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about before we continued. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
go ahead.
Rob, let me have, if you would, 106 A. We're talking about the 1929 stock market crash. Bill talks about on page 4, paragraph 1. Abruptly, in October of 1921, all hell broke loose on the exchange. This is, no, I believe it's 106A. It's a headline. There we go. There's a headline saying basically what we're talking about. Wall Street's in panic. Let's go back one picture before that, if you would. No, one before that. No, the other way. There we go. We were talking about, maybe you want to blow that up, that people were jumping out of windows because of the amounts of money that they were losing because of the way the investments were being made. And Steve did a great job of explaining that last week about how people bought on margin and the accounts were being called in and they just didn't have the money. So people were jumping out of windows. It was not a pleasant situation. And at the end of this paragraph, Bill mentions that people were jumping out of these windows of high finance. It disgusted him. He wouldn't jump. He's going to go to a bar. That these guys who are jumping are just weak. And as he said, as he drank, the old fierce determination to drink, to old fierce determination to win, liquid courage came back. Um, and I did a little bit of investigating. You could take that down, Rob. The term liquid courage, um, it actually came from the term Dutch courage. And how that happened, I don't know, because apparently at one point the Dutch had a reputation for being able to consume a lot of alcohol. So that's the expression that they used for some time. And then they decided, I guess, whoever is in charge of these usages decided that we're going to take the word Dutch out of it and just make it liquid courage, which I think seems a lot fairer, a lot better. But that's what we covered last week, and we're about to get into Napoleon. And if you like, I
Well,
could kick that off, or if you would like to.
I just want to mention something really quick. Is so the important thing that's going on. Let's look at the climate of this time. So it's you have the what they call the Roaring Twenties, and it's like huge economical growth. People that got rich that shouldn't have been rich. There's new inventions, new technology. The automobile assembly line took off. People became very rich. Um, there were, the refrigerator, the vacuum cleaner, all these things were taking off. Washing machines. Um, and the what people made money was in advertising, and lots became rich. And like radio broadcasts were created, the first baseball game, there was jazz, but all this stuff happened, and all this stuff, and plus you had the women's got right to vote in this time, which, women's changed the way they look till they cut their hair short, wore short dress, much more independence. And the thing about it was all the people, like I said, were making money, and they could just sit back and buy into advertising, and all of a sudden the stock market crashes. And all the people who were rich, beyond their wildest dreams was gone. And so just I think I mentioned this last week at the end, but I really want people to take in as a whole is Bill was into leveraging. And so what he did was, he would get a block of shares of 2,000 shares, and he had, other, the Bennington Corn Company and Pinnock and Ford and a few other ones, but he had multiple blocks. And what the leverage means was he would get, Howard and Rob and Emily, hey, give me $30 towards this block, and as it grows, you'll just grow into it. And you start putting your money down in it too. And, you know, the thing about it is that's a lot of money right there. Supposedly Bill, um, so 1,000 shares. So if you had a block, you lost $20,000 that day. So, I've heard stories that Bill had close to, 20 blocks of those. That's a lot of money right there. I've heard other people say he had a lot more than that, but you know, and the papers, like I said, these men are jumping out of buildings. There's pictures of that. I think Howard showed a picture. Did you show a picture of that?
Just put one up. Yeah.
Yeah, the guys jumping out of the buildings, and
Oh,
but
no,
the alcoholic comes out of Bill and says that disgusts me. I would not jump. I went back to the bar, and my friends had dropped several million since 10 o'clock. So what? Tomorrow's another day. And I said last week, I said that should be an alcoholic's tombstone. As I drank, the old fierce determination came back. So he lost millions, and his friends were killing themselves. So that's what's going on in his aspect. And remember, prohibition is still going on. And when Bill's drinking is not 80 proof, it's around 160 proof. 80 proof alcohol did not come out until after prohibition so they could make money, right? Watered down alcohol, watered down beer, stuff like that. So here's Bill, down, and he says the next morning I telegraphed a friend in Montreal. He had plenty of money left and thought I better go to Canada. By the following spring, we were living in our custom style. I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. No St. Helena for me, but drinking caught up to me again, and my generous friend had to let me go. And this time we stayed broke. Howard, you want to comment on that?
oh, absolutely. Let me go back a little bit. Rob, if you could start off with 4-2. Let me picture 4-2. We said next morning I telephoned a friend in Montreal. A friend in Montreal is this gentleman named, believe it or not, let's go back 2 pictures to the left. One more. Yeah, that's it. The guy's name, believe it or not, was Dick Johnson. You can't make this shit up. Dick Johnson was from the Green Shields Company. It was a brokerage house that didn't take the hit the way the New York Stock Exchange did. So he took a job with his friend in Montreal. And if you go to the next picture, in very short order, he was living in his accustomed style. He had moved his furniture up from the New York place, and he was living fat, playing golf again. He had a brand new Packard, and everything was great for Bill. But the following spring, it says he felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. Now, that's what I wanted to talk about. Napoleon was the emperor of France in the early 19th century, and he declared war on the European powers, namely British and Prussian, which later became parts of Germany and Belgium and so on. And he was defeated. In late 1813 and in early 1814, he was exiled in the Mediterranean. There was a place called the island of Elba, ELBA. It was an island off the Tuscan coast. And the European powers let him go there and maintain his sovereignty, which meant he can keep his title as emperor. And they allowed him to keep his troops with him on this island. And not surprisingly, a year later, he came back. He went back to the European mainland, declared war on the European powers again. This time he was defeated even faster than the first time. And when he was defeated the second time at the Battle of Waterloo, they banished him to the British Isle of St. Helena. And he never escaped from there. He was kept under house arrest, and that's a picture of him just kind of sitting on the coast of St. Helena. But the point of the story is this, and the only reason why I go through all these details is to kind of give some significance to the terminology that Bill uses. You could take that down, Rob. Bill's reference when he says, no St. Helena for me. I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. That would signify redemption, because when Napoleon came back from Elba, in his mind, it was redemption. It signifies redemption. And then when he said, no St. Helena for me, Helena is a symbol of saying final, absolute, irreversible defeat, because he didn't come back from St. Helena. So Bill is talking about in his usual grandiosity manner that when he came back like Napoleon from Elba, that he was the conquering hero coming back, but he got defeated even faster the second time. And he pointed out that there would be no St. Helena for him. He was not coming back from that one. And that's the significance of this St. Helena and Elba stuff. It's not an arbitrary thing. He's trying to make a point. And he also said, again, drinking caught up with him, and his generous friend had to let him go. So he was wearing out his welcome. He can't even hold a job. His progression continues.
So the important thing is to realize what that last sentence says. This time we stay broke. The allergy, the obsession have Bill's in the full grips of it, and we're going to see how many doom curves start really flying at us now. He says, we went to live with my wife's parents. Some of us have had to do that. I found a job and lost it as a result with a brawl with a taxi driver. Now here's doom curve number 4. Mercifully, no one could guess that I would get no real employment for 5 years or hardly draw a sober breath. Well, that's why he had no employment for 5 years. He can't draw a sober breath. But think about that. I always say alcoholics are, if you have the allergy obsession, you're completely unemployable. And you have some guys who go, I had a job for this long, but our resumes, are pages and pages of short-term jobs. Some of us never even had a job because we couldn't do it. You couldn't handle it. And then most of us towards the end of our drinking and using, it just, didn't happen. So look what it says now. It says, my wife began to work at a department store, coming home exhausted to find me drunk. And he says, I became an unwelcome hanger-on at brokerage places. That's the stock market. So the stock market brokerage places, they looked at him and said, I don't want this guy Bill around. And here's doom curve 5. And this is a big one right here. Liquor ceased to be a luxury. It became a necessity. Again, the person who's doom curves actually has a question. Do you remember when that happened to you? My experience was, alcohol was always there for me. But when I got into the powdered substances and stuff, I remember it was on the weekends. And it was, I was drinking all week long, but on the weekends I would hang out with those guys and do that. And then on a Tuesday, I went by like the dealer's house and bought some stuff from him. And he said to me, he says, I'll see you in a couple of days. Because it went from a luxury to a necessity. And it started to happen all the time. And it's this bathtub gin. That's what it was, made in the bathtub. 2 bottles a day, often 3 got to be routine. So 2 bottles a day. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I would pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. So remember I talked about the speakeasies. That's what he's talking about. I paid out. There was no real bars because it's prohibition, right? And the speakeasies, remember again, they had alcohol, drugs, prostitution, gambling, even had vapor alcohol in there. So if you were a real alcoholic, you probably had a tab, so to say. So here comes another doom curve. And there's you're gonna have three of them in a row. Doom curve 6 is this one endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. So now he's violently shaking. This is Doom curve 7. A tumbler full of gin, often followed by a dozen bottles of beer would be required for her to eat any breakfast. And some of us went through that, right? I remember I had to take a swig of alcohol just to get out of bed. That's what I was an alcoholic. So Tumberful, that's Doom Curve 7. Doom Curve 8, and this is the cry of an alcoholic. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation, and there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hopes. Periods, little short, bets here and there. So there's four Doom Curves there in one paragraph. If you look back at those, he's shaking violently in the morning. He needs booze, just to eat food, and he still thinks he can control it. You have anything you want to say on that situation, Howard?
Uh, Not on that, on the stuff that we're coming up to more.
Oh, okay. Well, here he goes. Gradually, so things you think things are bad. It says gradually things got worse. The house was taken away by the mortgage holder. Some of us went through that. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. Um, See, but here's the thing is I want to point out is not all those are results of drinking. And there's stuff that we go through on a normal basis. But don't forget, he's restless, irritable, and discontent. So he's hard to handle that stuff. So then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at a low point of 1932. I somehow formed a group to buy. I was to share generously in the profits, and I went on a prestigious bender, and the chance vanished. I know Howard's got something to say on this one.
Yeah, I want to back up a little bit to the previous paragraph. In fact, actually, I want to go back a little further. I forgot at the bottom of page 4. Anyone ever wonder about that brawl with the taxi driver, what that was about, who that was, right? Well, there's a story connected to it. There's a story connected to all of these things. When he came back from Canada, he somehow managed to get a job by a friend of his, an old friend of his on Wall Street by the name of Joe Hershenson, hired him. But the deal was that he not drink again. And very shortly after he got hired, he got in a fight it was a taxi driver in a bar. This was not in a taxi. This was in a bar. And Bill apparently was a violent drunk. When he got drunk, he was fighting. He's not one of those guys who was entertaining or doing anything like that. He was picking fights with people, and he picked the fight with the wrong guy here. A word got back to Hershenson, the owner of the company, and they had to let him go. But when they let him go, Hershenson, again, still liking Bill, gave him a check for $2,000. Go use that, you go take care of yourself. But he gave him a check for $2,000. And because he felt bad about it, Bill, on the way home, picked up a watch for Lois. And that night, he gave her the check for $2,000 and the watch as a gift. What do you think he did first thing next morning? He asked for the $2,000 back because he had an opportunity to invest in this proposition that Steve just mentioned. And I'm going to tell you a little, let Bill tell you the whole story. So hang on a sec. This,
So Doom Curve 9 is I woke up as had to be stopped. I saw I could not draw as much I'm sorry, so could not take as much as one drink. I was through forever. Before then, I had lots of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business. So I did. So one thing I want to point out here is Bill's program is don't take the first drink or don't drink no matter what. And what's interesting is every promise he made to Lois, he put in the family Bible. He would put little notes in the family Bible, and let's just see, and we'll reflect on this stuff in a minute. But let's just see how well that "Don't Drink No Matter What" program worked. And it's Doom Curve 10. Shortly afterward, I came home drunk, and look what he says: "There's been no fight." So much for that program, right? It doesn't work for alcoholics with obsessions, and allergies. Where had been my high resolve? I simply did not know it had even come to mind. And this is the interesting part. It's this book calls, that mental lapse, strange mental blank spots, and you hear it mentioned quite a bit in this book. Which we'll read later and more about alcoholism when Fred says, I saw that willpower itself now is going to help in those strange mental blank spots. He says when you're supposed to raise that defense of sound reasoning supposed to kick in, and common sense and self-knowledge, and it just floats by. Everything we knew about the guy, what he says that later on in the book, everything I knew about alcohol did not come to mind at all. They don't say, you didn't hear Bill say, I'm an alcoholic, this may not turn out well. This might cause me physical suffering. Doesn't happen. But that's a strange mental blank spots. It's a hazy blank spot, which, it leads right into Doom Curve 11. Someone had pushed a drink my way, and I had taken it. Was I crazy? So I began to wonder if such an appalling lack of perspective seemed nearing being just that. There's a lot of stuff hammered there. Yeah, anything you want to mention on that, Howard? Or?
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, going back, history is kind of one of my pet things. Gradually, things got worse. The house was taken over, etc. What does that mean? Well, what happened is Lois's mother passed away. Lois's father defaulted on the mortgage, and he then remarried and moved out of the house. But the bank could not take the house away from him because of Roosevelt's New Deal. He had what he called the mortgage moratorium, which forbade banks from disclosing on houses as long as the people who are in the house paid a small monthly fee, which is what Lois's father was doing. But he moved out and left it to Bill and Lois, and she could not hold on to that money that long, that kind of burden that long, because other things were happening. It said that my mother-in-law and my wife became ill. What she's talking about here is Lois had 3 ectopic pregnancies that almost killed her. And you could read about that in a number of places. But the interesting thing that I think about that is that when she was hospitalized 3 times for these pregnancies, Bill showed up at the hospital once. Only one time did he make it there. And then the next point that I wanted to make, that this promising opportunity. Let Bill Wilson tell you about that promising opportunity, because I think it's a better tale better told by Bill than by me. So let me get it for you here. Oops, hang on. Let me try it one more time. There we go. Share sound, share video, and we're off and running.
Some of you people may ask, why do these drunks continue to drink in the face of certain destruction? Why can't they stop? Well, this story will illustrate. One day I was sitting in a brokerage shop, and I fell into a conversation with a man who proved to be an heir to a great fortune. And I began my sales talk on how cheap securities were, how a syndicate ought to be put together to gather these things up. And he fell in with the idea. And I was to be the manager. Moreover, I was to have a third interest. Well, by the time we got that far in the conversations, they discovered about my drinking. So they came to me and they said, look, Bill, we know you got a real liquor problem. Would you be willing during the life of this thing to sign an agreement that you will not drink? That if you do drink, your interest in it will be ended. You know, the curious thing is, I really believed that I could stay sober when the incentive was so great. The work began, money came in, we began to buy securities, but now see what happened. One day, some old business acquaintances called me up. They said, Bill, we hear you're sober. They said, well, won't you go over in Jersey and do a piece of work for us? I said, sure.
Sorry.
The co-founder of the most
Sister's daughter took me up. I say took.
Of investing in a year.
Pain of it or increase the action. I began to feel different.
Ions. It does perfectly marvelous things.
To investigate these companies.
I'm really sorry.
And finally, there was a
Even before they were.
design. And
Right.
Will's big and terrible.
I think there was a great crash in the market. In the
To mandate almost the only
friends, we never friends, everybody. My family, his family.
I'm
friends,
sorry.
We never saw anybody. And we were just two people against the world. That's the way it seemed to us.
I'm gonna turn that off. I'm sorry. I lost that place.
Finally, I slide down into a state where I was not.
I apologize for that. Anyone who wants to see that, hang around after the meeting and we'll get back to it. I apologize. I lost that point. And I don't want
You
to
want to fill in the blank there, like what happened to him?
Yeah, what happened is that he had an opportunity. They knew that this was right up Bill's alley, so they gave him an opportunity to have a piece of this action, and that's where the $2,000 went. In order for him to get into it, he had to use that $2,000 that he had just gotten to Lois. But these guys heard about his drinking, so they made him sign a contract that said he wouldn't drink during the life of this, that if he did, he was out. He lost his investment, everything. And I think it's interesting when you listen to that, what Bill said about that. He said, I actually thought I could do that. Now, bearing in mind what's been going on up until this point, he can't hold a job in Montreal. He can't do this. He can't do that. Yet he somehow thinks, like we all do, that if you give me a good enough reason, I'll be able to do that. So they invest in this. They go to New Jersey and they're working on building this project together. And on the night before the final signing of the contracts and the execution of the deal, they're in a hotel room and they're playing cards and they're passing around the bottle. And when they comes by Bill, he says, no, nope, I can't drink that. And the guys say, Bill, this is Jersey Lightning, man. This is the finest Applejack ever made. How could you not? And he said, nope, I can't take any alcohol at all. And the bottle keeps going around and around, and they keep offering it to him, and he keeps passing on it. And then he says, at one point, a curtain dropped between me and reality, and they offered me the drink, and I took it. And the next thing I know, it was 3 days later. I had in a blackout for 3 days in the hotel room, and the deal was over, and he'd lost his $2,000. That's the famous Jersey Lightning story, that he had to give in because he figured, I'd never had any Jersey Lightning. I got
Right.
to try this stuff. Now, how many of us have been in those kind of situations? Wow, I haven't tried any of that. This will be safe. These are safe drugs.
Well, I love that story because the whole aspect in there with the obsession, talking to him and saying, "Hey, you never tried that before.
Yeah.
You never had no Jersey Lightning. You know, maybe you can just have just one shot." So let's go back to the book here. It says, "Renewing my resolve, I tried again. Some time had passed, and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness." So, cocksureness could be called high self-esteem, but could also be called the ego. And ego is where, I'm better than you, I know more than you, and you separate yourself from people. And we'll see this right here, what he says. He starts to separate himself from people. I could laugh at the gin mills. Now I had what it takes. That's a high self-esteem. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. So, his life is going to go down the toilet right now because the doom curves are going to fly. So doom curve 12, right after he walked in the bar. In no time, I was beating on the bar, asking myself how it happened again. Doom curve 13. And this is really deep. As the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I would manage better next time, but I might as well get good and drunk. And so I did. The tall drink of ethanol. You know, Doom curve 14. The remorse and horror and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. The courage to battle was not there. Doom curve 15. My brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. Doom curve 16. I hardly dared cross the street, lest I collapse and be run over by an early morning truck, for it was scarcely daylight. Doom curve 17. An all-night place supplied me with a half a dozen glasses of ale, and my withering nerves were still at last. Well, thank God he found that place, right? Look what it says next. It says, a morning paper told me the market had gone to hell again. Well, so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. That was a hard thought, and that leads to Durham curve 18. Should I kill myself? No, not now. Then a mental fog settled, and gin would fix that. So 2 bottles of gin and living. I'll tell you what my grandsponsor used to say. Thank God Bill was drinking because he may have killed himself. Because that's, alcoholics, when they're dry, that's what, when that happens a lot. And it's some deep stuff right there. And look at this. The mind and body are marvelous mechanisms, for mine endured this agony 2 more years. That goes to Doom Curve 19. Sometimes I stole from my wife's slender purse when the morning terror and madness were on me. He didn't say to himself, I shouldn't do that. I love my wife. No, he needed it. Doom Curve 20. Again, I swayed dizzy before the open window or the medicine cabinet where there's poisoned, cursing myself a weakling. There were flights from city to country and back as my wife and I sought escape. And then Doom Curve 21. Then come the night when the physical and mental torture was so hellish, I feared I would burst through my window, sash and all. Somehow, I managed to drag a mattress to the lower floor. At least I suddenly leap. Well, that's a smart thing to do, I guess. Doom Curve 22. A doctor came by. Cool doctor. A doctor came by with a heavy sedative. Next day, found me drinking both gin and sedative. Of course he was. Now, there's drugs mentioned in this book, as much as people don't say there is. This combination soon landed me on the rocks. Doom Curve 23. People feared for my sanity. So did I. And Doom Curve 24. I could eat little or nothing when drinking, and I was 40 pounds underweight. I don't know. When I first read that, it blew my mind because here I was sitting in rehab reading this book, and I was about 60 pounds underweight, 140 pounds. And then it goes to Doom Curve 25. My brother, this is a very important part in here. I'll let Howard talk about it. But my brother-in-law is a physician, and through his kindness and that of my mother, I was placed in a nationally known hospital for the mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics. You want to talk about Dr. Strong?
Well, I want to go back. I don't want to interrupt your flow of the doom curve, so I'm going to try and take a back seat here. But we started out with what I think is one of the best descriptions of jonesing that I ever came across. And every time I read it, it gives me chills when he says the remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning were unforgettable. The courage to do battle was not there. My brain raced uncontrollably. Can anyone identify with that? And there was a terrible sense of impending calamity, impending disaster. That is morning terror and madness. He uses that term later on in the paragraph, but that's what he's describing. He's jonesing, he's withdrawing. And that's a great explanation from it. And later in that paragraph, he mentions the market would recover, but I wouldn't. There's been a change. There's been a change from the last time there was a crash. Remember, there were guys jumping out the window and he was taking like, they're weak. I wouldn't do that. I'm going to go to the bar and have a few hits. I'm going to survive this. Remember the liquid courage? I'm going to come back tomorrow even stronger and even harder. And here he is a few pages later, and he realizes there's no coming back from here. There's no thought. He's just so hopeless about it that he realizes I'm not coming back. The market may come back, but I won't. And that same paragraph ends with Bill falling into using for the worst reason of all. Remember, I mentioned last week to try and, as we go through this, keep track of certain things. And one of those is Bill's progression from when he was using for fun, moments sublime and intervals hilarious. And then he's using it more because to function. Remember, it ceased to be a luxury. And now he's drinking for the worst reason of all, the seeking of oblivion. It's not fun. He's not functioning. It's just him in the bottle. And I don't know about any of you guys, but in the end of my run, that's all I cared about. I was not partying with anybody. I was not functioning with anybody. It was just me and the chemicals, and that was it. I didn't want to have anything else to do with anyone else. And he says that continued for 2 years. That those morning terror and madness continued for 2 years. Can you imagine going through that? And then, as Steve mentioned, a doctor came. That doctor is his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law's name is Leonard Strong, his sister's husband. But there's something real important in this paragraph, this last paragraph. A doctor came with heavy sedative. Next day found me, and I would underline this, drinking both gin and heavy sedative. Here's what gets looked over way too often. The next sentence says, this combination soon landed me on the rocks. What that means, at least to me, very clearly, is Bill bottomed out when he added drugs into his diet. He wasn't just drinking at this point. He was drinking and taking sedatives. And this wasn't a one of a kind thing. He was doing it on a regular basis. That combination of alcohol and drugs bottomed him out. That's founder number one. And if you've read Dr. Bob's story, you know that he had a 17-year addiction to goofballs, to sedatives. So both of our founders bottomed out on alcohol and drugs. So if you start a meeting today and you hold fast to only alcoholics are allowed into this meeting, our two founders would be banned from that meeting. So just keep that in mind. Both of our founders bottomed out on alcohol and drugs. I'm not making it up. That's what the book says. Do we want to get into my brother's a physician and into Towns Hospital?
Yeah, did you want to talk about Strong or Leonard Strong?
Yeah,
Or?
Leonard Strong, his brother-in-law. Sorry, that's what I started out doing. Leonard Strong was his brother-in-law. And besides administering the medications to him, he also, along with Bill's mother, picked up the tab for Bill's hospitalizations at Towns, and that was pretty hefty. That was not a cheap place to go.
It's like $450 for like a 4 to 6 day stay.
Something like that, yeah. And the point is, but the thing with Leonard Strong is, besides all of that, Leonard Strong knew a guy named Willard Richardson. Willard Richardson was the right-hand man of John D. Rockefeller.
Right.
In order to get into Rockefeller's office, you had to walk through the secretary's office, then a mid-office that was Willard Richardson's office. And in order to get through to Rockefeller, you had to get through Richardson. That was his personal secretary. He was the stop guard, preventing people from getting in to see the old man. And Leonard Strong knew him. So when Bill got better later and he wanted to get some money and he thought of Rockefeller, the way Bill got to Rockefeller was through his brother-in-law, who spoke to Leonard Strong, who spoke to Willard Richardson, and Willard Richardson arranged for that appointment with Rockefeller. That's the importance to me of Leonard Strong. Besides paying for the hospitalizations, he got Bill in to see Rockefeller. Without him, Bill might not have even gotten that far. Even though he didn't get anything, he wouldn't have gotten that far.
So it says, let me get some good stuff here. Under the so-called belladonna treatment, my brain cleared. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise helped much. So this belladonna treatment was a mixture of like called henbane, which was dried berries, tons of other plants, basically to get rid of intestinal clamps and clear you out, not the way you like to go to the bathroom. And heavy detox. But listen to, I mean, it was given every hour on the hour for 50 hours until patient's face became flushed, cleared, his eyes cleared, and and then on top of that, as he's doing that, they're giving him physical exercise. That was all, Dr. Towns' thing he pushed. But the one thing I want to recommend, and it's pissed me off over the years, is when people say that it was the belladonna treatment that had Bill hallucinate to have a spiritual experience. He did not do the belladonna treatment on his last trip there because he couldn't. You can only give the belladonna treatment for 2 to 3 times to a patient. Otherwise, it could destroy your intestines and kill you. And I have a friend of mine that was a doctor and explained that to me. And he says, there's no way, sometimes only once as they could give it to somebody, especially if they had previous intestinal problems. And remember, Bill talked about his imaginary ulcers and stuff he had, So now we're coming to a big point here, because this is when Bill meets Dr. Silkworth. He says, best of all, I met a kind doctor who explained, though certainly I was certainly selfish and foolish, I have been seriously ill, bodily and mentally. So Phil Silkworth gave him his diagnosis. He says, I couldn't figure out what was going on. I don't know what happened. Where had been my resolve? We just figured it out. This guy told him, you have a physical, your body's sick. It's called a physical allergy. Once you put this drink in your body, you crave more. And when you're off of it, your body tells you that you need it again. And Bill started to get it. But how did Bill, let's see how Bill took that diagnosis. He says, I was relieved, it relieved me somewhat to learn that in alcoholics that the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor. Though it often seems strong, remains strong in other respects, my incredible behavior in the face of desperate desire to stop was explained. Understanding myself now, I feared and high hope. I love this. For 4 months, the goose hung high. I went to town regularly. As I say, 4 months, he had, silver. Went to town regularly, and even made a little money. But look what he says next. He's going to try his next program. Surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. So self-knowledge is information that we draw up when finding an answer or reminding ourselves what we have learned. Oh, I drank that, yesterday. I can't, self-knowledge, I can't drink, you know, and remember he tried Don't Take the First Drink program. Now he's trying the self-knowledge program, remembering he's alcoholic. And let's see how well this one works out. Doom curve 26. But it was not, for the frightful day came when I drank once more. The curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. And after a time, I returned to the hospital, towns again. This was the finish, the curtain, it seemed to me. Doom curve 27, my weary and despairing wife was informed that it would all end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I would develop wet brain perhaps in a year. She would soon have to take me over to the undertaker of the asylum. So just understand wet brain for a second. It's permanent brain damage. Permanent. In that it's caused by, by extensive alcohol abuse. Like when you have cirrhosis, you're pickling your liver, basically wet brain is your brain being pickled to a degree. But it creates confusion, mental loss, loss of bodily functions, loss of sight, memory, loss, leg tremens, double vision, death. It's compared to ALS, and it cannot be reversed. See, also it says they did not need to tell me. I knew, and I almost welcomed the idea. It was a devastating blow to my pride. I think we've all been there, to where we find out how sick we are, and we kind of like welcome it, going, "Well, this is it." Anything you want to say on that, Howard?
Well, for the wet brain that you're talking about actually has a medical description. It's called Korsakoff syndrome, Korsakoff syndrome. And it says, after a time I returned to the hospital. This was a year later. This was stay number 2. Remember, Bill was hospitalized 4 times. Right now, he's talking about the second stay. What's the other thing I wanted to point out to you here? And again, I want to let you keep your momentum with those things. Go ahead. Go ahead. I don't want to interrupt that. Go ahead. Continue.
I, who had thought so well of myself and my abilities, of my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last, as egos being deflated. Now I was to plunge into darkness, joining the endless progression of sots who have gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What I had not given to make, what I would not give to make amends. But that was over now. Bill's exactly where he's supposed to be. For an alcoholic, he's exactly where he's supposed to be. It's not the good time for someone to walk in on him and say, "Hey, we're taking you to rehab." This is where the guy is supposed to sink more, right? Doom curve 28. No words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in bitter mouths of self-pity. Quicksand stretched all around me in all directions. I had met my match. I've been overwhelmed. Alcohol is my master. He finally admitted defeat. And I said step 1, you don't take step 1, step 1 takes you. That's what I mean right there.
This is a great description, if you think about it, of imagine what it must have been like. Today, you can go to AA. Today, you can go to a rehab or a detox. Where's he going to go? Quicksand surrounds him on all sides. You know what the thing about quicksand is? The more you resist it, the faster you sink in it.
It's like undertow.
That's right. So imagine, what it was like for him without the options that we have. There's no recovery possible to him. And he's feeling now that God's grace isn't even available to him, that it's all over. This is what I call Bill Wilson's lament. Loneliness, despair, and that line, quicksand. I've stolen that and use that in my story all the time. Quicksand surrounded me on all directions. Think about what that must have been like. And again, put yourself in his place back then. Today, there's any number of things you could do to take care of a problem like that. Today, then back in 39, 35, no, nothing.
So I'm going to read this paragraph and let Howard tell this story of Armistice Day, and we'll close with that. But it says, trembling, I stepped from the hospital, a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. Someone's been to that doom curve. Then came the insidious insanity of the first drink on Armistice Day in 1934. I was off again. In doom curve 20, everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along a miserable end. How dark is it for the dawn. So out of brokenness, he's going to see his opportunity to live. Howard, you want to tell the armistice story?
Yeah, absolutely. Bill decided, hang on, let me get you here. It was off. He wanted to go play golf and he couldn't afford an expensive club. So he knew there was a public course in Staten Island. And if you're familiar with the New York area, it's not a hop, skip, and a jump. So he had to take a bus, a train over the bridge to Staten Island. And when he got on the train, got on the trolley in Staten Island, he sat next to a guy who had a gun case. And he got talking with the guy because that's what Bill does. He's a talker. And it turns out that the guy was going to a shooting range that was just a little bit beyond the golf course that Bill was going to. So Bill is sitting there with his golf clubs, and this guy's sitting there with his rifles. And as they're talking about this, boom, they get slammed from behind, and the bus is immovable. So they push it aside. And while they're waiting for the replacement bus, they get talking more and more about this stuff, and they're getting closer. And Bill is telling him his story, and they decide to go into a bar to have I'm sorry, they get a replacement bus comes by, and they take him down to the point at which Bill has to get off for his golf and the other guy has to get off for the shooting range. But they're stopping in front of a bar and grill, and they decide to go in and have a sandwich, have some lunch before they do the rest of it, or they go on their separate ways. And they go in and they order a sandwich, and that happens to be Armistice Day. And the bartender says, Armistice Day, free drinks, everybody in the house, take a drink. And Bill just reached out, took it without even thinking. And the guy said to him, you'd already told me that you are a hopeless alcoholic, that you can't take just one, that you have this physical allergy and this mental obsession. Because on the bus, that's what Bill was talking about. That's what he was telling him about, all about his story with alcohol. And the guy said, and here the guy puts a glass in front of you, and without even thinking, without even blinking, you take that drink. You must be crazy. And that's what Bill said. I am. And that was the end of the story. Bill remained there, and the other guy continued off to the shooting range. And Bill came home the next night, and Lois found him in the entryway of their home. They had this like little mud room with a big gash on his head because he had fallen down as he usually does and cut his head open. And that's the story of Armistice Day drinking for Bill.
All right. So, this is going to lead into, after you said the last, the bar is, I'll be catapulted in the fourth dimension of existence. So it's going to start getting into away from the doom curves. And so a couple more left, but I'm going to stop the recording there and we'll pick up next week.
But also, incidentally, one of the things that are pointed out in this paragraph starts out with fear sobered me for a bit. Let's make note of that we're talking now about another inadequate, insufficient higher power. We've talked about frothy emotional appeals. We've talked about self-knowledge. We've talked about self-will. And now we're talking about fear. All of these inadequate, insufficient higher powers.
Great point. Great point. I'm going to stop the recording here.